I had already folded the sweater. The soft blue one. The one my late husband used to say made me look awake, even when I was tired. It was nearly midnight. The house had that hollow quiet it only gets when the world assumes you're asleep, or already forgotten. I placed the sweater into the small overnight bag at my feet. I wasn't running away. I wasn't panicking. I told myself that over and over as I zipped it shut with careful fingers. Just one night elsewhere. That was all. One night to clear my head, to breathe without being watched, to remind myself I still knew how to leave my own front door. They'd been saying I shouldn't go out alone anymore. Not directly. Never directly. It was always phrased gently. For your safety, Lorianne. Just until you're feeling more yourself. You know we worry. Worry can sound a lot like control if you listen long enough. I lifted the bag, feeling its unfamiliar weight tug against my wrist, and turned toward the hallway. The lights were off, but I didn't need them. I'd walked these floors for 37 years. I knew which board near the study side when stepped on. I knew where the cold air gathered near the back door. I knew this house. Or at least, I thought I did. That's when I sensed him. Not heard. Sensed. A presence behind me, too still, too quiet to be accidental. Elric? I said, softly. He didn't answer right away. He stood at the end of the hallway, half in shadow, half in the faint glow of the porch light leaking through the curtains. My caregiver. My helper. The man everyone said I was lucky to have. You're up late, he finally said. His voice was calm. Too calm. I'm staying with a friend tonight, I replied, keeping my tone light. Casual. The way they liked it when I didn't complicate things. He took one step forward. Then another. I noticed then that he wasn't wearing his shoes. Elric, I said again, this time firmer. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want a fuss. I reached for the door handle. That's when his hand closed around my wrist. Not hard. Not violent. Urgent. His grip wasn't meant to hurt, it was meant to stop time. I froze. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. Don't leave tonight, ma'am, he whispered. His face was close now. Close enough for me to see the fine sheen of sweat at his temple. Close enough to notice that his eyes, usually steady, observant, were wide with something I'd never seen in them before. Fear. If you do, he swallowed. His voice dropped even lower. You won't come back. The house seemed to lean in around us. Every sound sharpened, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the old clock in the living room, the faint creak of wood settling as if the walls themselves were listening. I pulled my hand back instinctively. Excuse me? I said. He released me immediately, stepping away as if he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. I can't explain, he said quickly. Too quickly. Not yet. Then why would you say something like that? My heart was beating faster now, betraying the calm I was trying to hold on to. You're my caregiver, Elric. You don't get to frighten me and walk away. He looked toward the front windows. Then toward the hallway that led to the study. Then back at me. You don't understand what's already been set in motion, he said. But if you leave this house tonight, they'll say you chose it. And once that happens, no one will listen to anything you say after. They? I echoed. His hands were shaking now. Not dramatically. Subtly. The way a man shakes when he's holding something together by force alone. Please, he said. Just stay inside. Lock the door behind you. And don't let anyone know you were planning to go. Every instinct I had screamed at once. Was this a threat? A warning? Had I misjudged the one person I was told to trust? I looked at my bag on the floor. Looked at the door. Looked back at him. And in that moment, a terrifying thought settled into my bones. Someone was expecting me to leave tonight. And whatever would happen next required my absence. I didn't walk out. Instead, I picked up my bag slowly and carried it back down the hall. Behind me, Elric exhaled, long, unsteady. I didn't see him follow. I didn't hear him leave. But as I stood alone in my bedroom, door closed, light off, listening to the house breathe around me, one question echoed louder than any other. Why would a caregiver risk everything to stop me from leaving? And if he wasn't the danger, what exactly was he protecting me from? If you've ever felt someone older was being quietly pushed aside, subscribe now. And if you haven't, stay anyway. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why people like me need voices before it's too late. I didn't turn on the bedroom light. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, my overnight bag resting at my feet like an accusation. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to slow my breathing. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Just like they taught me years ago, back when people believed I was capable of learning new things. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. I waited for Elric's footsteps. For the sound of him moving down the hallway. For the click of the front door opening, then closing. Nothing came. It was as if he'd vanished into the walls the moment I looked away. That was when I understood something important. If Elric had wanted to hurt me, he wouldn't have warned me. And if he was afraid, then I had already waited too long to ask why. I stood slowly and placed the bag in the closet, pushing it behind coats I hadn't worn in years. Then I closed the door softly, careful not to let the latch click. Something in me had shifted. A switch, perhaps. I wasn't leaving. I was staying. But I wasn't sleeping either. I cracked my bedroom door and peered into the hallway. The faint porch light still leaked through the front curtains, casting long, unfamiliar shadows across the floor. I'd lived here long enough to recognize the difference between normal darkness and the kind that feels staged. I stepped out. The first thing I noticed was the sound. A faint hum. Barely there. Like an insect trapped in the walls. I followed it toward the living room, each step measured, my slippers barely brushing the floor. When I reached the corner near the bookshelf, I saw it. A small black dome mounted high near the ceiling. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. A motion sensor. Not one of the old security ones we deactivated years ago. This one was newer. Smaller. Sleeker. And unmistakably powered on. My mouth went dry. I had never approved this. No one had asked me. No one had explained. And yet here it was, watching a room I was told was safe. Slowly, deliberately, I waved my hand beneath it. A tiny red light blinked once. I dropped my arm and backed away. That's when the house stopped feeling like mine. I moved toward the study next, the place I used to escape when I wanted quiet. The door resisted slightly when I turned the handle. Locked. That alone was enough to make my chest tighten. The study had never been locked. Not even when important papers were inside. Not even after my husband passed. I pressed my palm flat against the wood, as if it might remember me. "It's me," I whispered, foolishly. The door did not respond. I knelt and tried the lower drawer of the nearby filing cabinet instead, one I remembered holding old insurance documents and handwritten notes. Also locked. A newer lock, too. I could tell by the shine of the metal. Someone had reorganized my life without telling me. I stood there longer than I should have, listening for movement, for breathing that wasn't my own. The hum was louder here. Not louder exactly, closer. Like the house was clearing its throat. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I pulled it out quickly, relief flooding me when I saw a signal. Then the screen went black. No warning. No low battery message. Just dead. "That's not right," I muttered. I'd charged it earlier that evening. Watched it reach 100%. I pressed the power button again. Nothing. I walked into the kitchen and plugged it into the wall. The screen flickered weakly, then lit up, only to drop to 3% in seconds. Before I could react, the screen dimmed again. A call came through. Unknown number. I answered. "Hello?" Static crackled on the line, thick and uneven. I thought I heard breathing on the other end. Then, click. The call dropped. I stared at the phone in my hand, the reflection of my own face faintly visible on the dark screen. I looked older like this. Smaller. Easier to dismiss. That's when I heard the front door. Not opening. Closing. Softly. I turned just in time to see Elric standing by the coat rack, pulling on his shoes with hurried movements. "Elric," I said sharply. He flinched. "I have to go," he said without meeting my eyes. "Where?" I asked. He straightened, finally looking at me. His expression was strained, like a man bracing for impact. "Somewhere I can't explain," he said. "But listen to me carefully." He stepped closer, lowering his voice again. "Do not answer the door tonight," he said. "Do not take calls you don't recognize. And whatever you do, do not tell anyone you plan to leave." "You expect me to sit here alone?" I asked. "After what you've shown me." "I expect you to stay alive," he replied. Then he was gone. The door shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there, phone clutched in my hand, staring at the place where he'd been. And that's when the truth settled over me, cold and undeniable. This wasn't about keeping me inside. It was about making sure I left. Someone had prepared for my absence. The sensors. The locks. The phone. Tonight wasn't random. Tonight was scheduled. And if I had walked out that door like I planned, whatever happened next would have been written off as my own choice. I turned slowly, taking in the walls, the ceiling, the corners of rooms I thought I knew. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a witness. And I had the sinking feeling that it had already been watching me for a very long time. I couldn't sleep. I sat at the small kitchen table with the lights dimmed, my dead phone lying face up beside a cold cup of tea. Every few minutes, I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting another red light to blink or another lock to click shut on its own. The house watched. And as I sat there, pieces of the past began arranging themselves in my mind, not as memories usually do, soft and scattered, but with sharp edges, snapping into place like a puzzle I'd been forced to abandon halfway through. Forgetful. That was the word they'd started with. Not ill. Not confused. Just forgetful. It sounded harmless the first time. "You already told me that, Mum," Jareth had said gently, smiling the way people smile at children. "You're getting ahead of yourself again." I remember laughing it off. Everyone forgets things now and then. Names. Dates. Where they put their glasses. But then it became frequent. "You don't remember that conversation? Are you sure you didn't imagine that? Maybe you were just tired." Each time said kindly. Calmly. As if concern itself were proof. I stared down at my hands now, resting on the table, and remembered how often they'd guided my pen for me. "Just sign here, Lorianne," Jareth would say, sliding papers across the desk. "This is just for convenience. So I can help with the bills. You don't want to deal with all that stress anymore." Convenience. I'd always hated paperwork. He knew that. My husband handled most of it when he was alive, and after he passed, the stacks felt heavier somehow. Taller. More exhausting. So I signed. Once. Then again. Then without reading. Each time, I was thanked for being sensible. Praised for trusting him. Told how lucky I was to have family who cared. I'd felt proud then. Now I felt sick. My mind drifted to the medications. At first, it was just one pill added to the routine. Small. White. Supposed to help me sleep. Then another. And another. I remembered asking Elric once why my head felt so foggy in the mornings. "Doctor's orders," he'd said carefully. "But I can ask if you'd like." I had wanted to say yes. But before I could, Jareth had waved a hand dismissively. "She worries herself into symptoms," he'd said with a soft chuckle. "You know how she gets." How I get. I swallowed hard. The kitchen clock ticked on, indifferent. Then there was Dr. Halden Reese. I could picture him clearly now, how he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes kind but distant. How he never quite looked at me when he spoke. "Age-related confusion," he'd said once, jotting something down. "Nothing alarming. Very common." I tried to protest. Tried to explain that I still balanced my own accounts. That I still read every night. That I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, entire conversations word for word. He'd smiled. "That's good," he said. "But perception can be tricky. Especially when stress is involved." Stress. That word followed everything I said after that. If I disagreed, I was stressed. If I asked questions, I was anxious. If I insisted something was wrong, I was fixated. Reality itself began to feel negotiable. What terrified me most, sitting there in the half-light, was how gradual it all had been. No shouting. No ultimatums. No single moment where I could say, "This is where I lost myself." They didn't need to hurt me. They just needed me to doubt myself long enough to step aside willingly. I pushed back from the table and walked slowly toward the living room, my gaze lifting to the walls. Family photos stared back at me, snapshots of holidays, gatherings, moments where I looked present. Alive. I wasn't fragile in those pictures. I was just older. And somehow, that had been enough. I stopped in front of the mirror near the hallway and studied my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked tired, yes. Worn, perhaps. But her eyes were clear. Too clear for the role they'd written for her. They didn't attack my body, I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. They changed the story. And once you let someone else narrate your life, you become very easy to erase. A faint sound drifted through the house then, a subtle shift, like something being activated elsewhere. A low mechanical hum that reminded me of the motion sensor blinking quietly in the living room. I wasn't just being watched. I was being managed. And suddenly, Elric's fear made sense. This wasn't about tonight alone. This was about making sure that when I finally disappeared, legally, medically, conveniently, no one would question it. Because they'd already taught everyone who I was supposed to be. If you're watching this and you still haven't subscribed, ask yourself why stories like this make people uncomfortable. And if you won't subscribe, go to the comments and explain why. I read them all. The house grew quieter after midnight. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your ears, heavy with expectation. I stayed still in the shadow of the hallway, listening to the hum of electricity running through wires I hadn't authorized, through systems I hadn't asked for but was now living inside. I remembered something then. A week earlier, Elric had mentioned the security monitor in passing. Sometimes the night sensors glitch, he'd said, almost casually. If you ever hear a faint click near the study, that's just the system cycling. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Now, I followed the sound. The study door was ajar, just enough to let a line of light spill onto the carpet. Inside, behind a framed landscape painting I'd never chosen, was a narrow panel I didn't recognize. My fingers trembled as I slid it aside. A screen flickered to life. For black and white feeds appeared, front door, back garden, hallway, and the driveway. My stomach tightened. The house hadn't just been watching me. It had been watching everything. I leaned closer, heart pounding, when movement caught my eye. Elric. He appeared on the driveway feed, pulling on his coat, glancing once toward the house before stepping outside. He didn't look hurried. He didn't look guilty. He looked careful. I muted the other feeds and focused on the audio channel tied to the exterior mic, a feature I doubted Jareth even remembered existed. Static crackled. Then voices. Elric's first. Low. Controlled. "You're late," he said. Another man answered, older, steadier, with a gravelly calm that reminded me of someone who'd seen systems fail before. "Traffic," the man replied. "And I don't like meeting this close to the house." Spence Calder. I didn't know his name then. But I would never forget his voice. I watched as the two men stood beneath the weak glow of the driveway light. Spence carried a slim leather folder tucked under his arm. "Any changes?" Spence asked. Elric shook his head slightly. "They've accelerated the timeline." My breath caught. "Property transfers?" Spence pressed. "2 already filed. 1 more pending. Insurance paperwork's been updated too, beneficiary shift finalized last week." Insurance. Timelines. Words that should never be whispered about someone who was still alive. "And her?" Spence asked. Elric hesitated. "She's sharper than they think," he said quietly. "But they're adjusting her meds again. If that happens, she won't have the clarity much longer." Final clearance. That phrase landed like a weight on my chest. "What about the doctor?" Spence asked. "He'll sign once he gets confirmation of behavioral instability." That's what tonight was supposed to be. Tonight. The night I was meant to leave. My knees weakened, and I sank slowly onto the chair behind the desk, never taking my eyes off the screen. "You're sure about this?" Spence said. "Once this moves forward, there's no reversing it." Elric straightened. "I've seen this pattern before," he said. "Different names. Different houses. Same outcome. There was something in his voice then, anger, tightly leashed. I worked elder care compliance for 11 years, he continued. Facilities, guardianships, emergency commitments. People don't vanish. They're processed. A pause. I didn't leave that job because I was tired, Elric said. I left because I couldn't stop it from happening fast enough. My throat tightened. So why stay here? Spence asked. Why not report it now? Because suspicion without proof gets buried, Elric replied. And because once they know they're being watched, they move faster. Sloppier. That's when mistakes happen. I understood then. Elric hadn't grabbed my wrist to trap me. He'd done it to interrupt a script already in motion. I needed her to stay, Elric said softly. Leaving tonight would have triggered the emergency protocol. Police wellness check. Doctor's affidavit. Transport order by morning. A living checklist. And now? Spence asked. Elric's gaze lifted toward the house. Toward me. Now, he said, she's awake. The two men fell silent. Spence exhaled slowly. Then it's time. For what? Elric asked. To finish gathering proof, Spence replied. And to make sure she's not alone when this breaks. They shook hands, brief and firm, then Spence turned toward his car. As Elric headed back inside, I stepped away from the screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. The man I'd been taught to fear was the only one standing between me and erasure. He hadn't stayed because he was loyal. He'd stayed because he was waiting. Waiting for evidence. Waiting for the moment when I could see clearly enough to fight back. The house creaked softly as the door opened. I didn't retreat to my room. I stood my ground in the hallway, heart steadying, spine straightening. For the first time since the whisper at the door, I wasn't afraid. I was informed. And that made all the difference. I confront Elric that night. I didn't reveal that I'd seen the security feed, or heard his conversation with Spence Calder, or understood how close I'd come to vanishing behind paperwork and locked doors. I did something far more dangerous. I played the part they'd written for me. The next morning, I let my hands shake when I poured my tea. I spilled a little on the counter and stared at it as if I didn't understand how it had happened. Elric noticed, of course. You all right, ma'am? He asked gently. I looked up too slowly. Have we met before? The question hurt to say. Something flickered across his face, not surprise, not fear, but relief. They're watching, he said softly, just loud enough for the motion sensor in the corner to catch it. You're doing fine. Fine. That word became our code. From that moment on, every movement was a performance layered on top of another performance. When Jareth called, I answered on the third ring, then asked him why my phone was ringing while it was already in my hand. I thought someone was calling, I said, my voice thin. Is that you, dear? There was a pause on the line. Then satisfaction. Yes, Lorianne, he said kindly. It's me. I misspelled words on purpose in emails, recept, calendar, medicine, small errors, easy to dismiss, impossible to correct without sounding cruel. I asked the same question twice during a single conversation. What day is it again? And did you say Tuesday? Each time, someone made a note. Each time, I let them. What they didn't see was what happened after. In the privacy of my bedroom, I pressed the small recorder hidden inside the lining of my handbag and spoke clearly, carefully. Log entry. Tuesday. Medication adjusted again without explanation. Blue capsule added. No label. Ulrich unaware. I photographed everything. The locked cabinet in the study. The unsigned consent forms. The calendar entries that appeared in handwriting that wasn't mine. I kept track of times, doses, side effects. When my head felt heavy, when my thoughts blurred at the edges, I documented that too. Especially that. Because I needed proof not just of what they were doing, but of how it felt. At night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe around me. The soft clicks of sensors. The faint hum of electronics. I practiced confusion the way an actor practices lines. Why is the door locked? Did I already eat? Are we waiting for someone? Each question was measured. Each pause calculated. Too little, and they'd doubt the diagnosis. Too much, and they'd escalate. I walked that line every hour. The audience, you, knew the truth. You heard my thoughts when no one else could. You saw the clarity behind the act. But inside the house, they were relaxing. I could feel it. Voices softened. Plans were discussed more openly. Documents were left out just a little longer. They thought they were winning. That was the most dangerous moment of all. Because pretending to be broken does something to you. Even when you know it's an act, even when you understand the strategy, a part of your mind begins to wonder. What if this is who I am now? What if I forget the line between performance and reality? Some nights, I pressed my palm flat against my chest just to feel my heart beating, solid, present, mine. How long could I keep this up? How long before the act cost me something I couldn't get back? Because every day I stayed, the net tightened. And the longer they believed the story they'd written for me, the harder it would be to convince anyone that it was a lie. I was hiding in plain sight. And the clock was running. The performance couldn't last forever. I knew that the moment I woke with my heart racing, the house still dark, my mouth dry from the new medication they'd slipped into my routine the night before. My thoughts were slower now, not gone, not scattered, but heavy, as if I were thinking through water. That frightened me more than anything else had. Because I could feel time slipping. That morning, while Ulrich prepared breakfast downstairs, I did something I hadn't done before. I went back into the study in daylight. The locked cabinet sat exactly where I'd left it, quiet and unassuming. I'd photographed it before, catalogued the exterior, memorized the way the keyhole caught the light. But this time, I wasn't looking for evidence. I was looking for structure. It took less than a minute to open. Inside, beneath neatly labeled folders and clipped stacks of paper, was a single document in a clear sleeve. Care Continuity Plan. The title alone made my skin crawl. It sounded benign. Responsible. The kind of phrase used by people who wanted to appear thoughtful. It wasn't care. It was a schedule. I sat in the desk chair and began to read. Phase 1, Baseline Documentation. Establish pattern of cognitive decline. Witness corroboration. Medication adjustment, non-invasive. A check mark beside every line. Dates next to each one. All in the past. Phase 2, Clinical Confirmation. Specialist referral. Diagnosis alignment. Behavioral instability notation. Another check mark. Another past date. I turned the page, my hands steady now in a way they hadn't been all week. Phase 3, Asset Safeguarding. Power of Attorney Activation. Property Transfer Initiation. Insurance Beneficiary Finalization. I stopped breathing. I recognized the signatures. They were mine. Placed there during moments I'd been told were routine. Phase 4, Controlled Environment Placement. Facility selection approved. Intake authorization. Emergency trigger identification. Emergency trigger. That phrase appeared again and again. And then, in bold. Trigger event, unscheduled departure or noncompliance. My stomach dropped. Tonight hadn't been about my safety. It had been about compliance. I flipped to the final page. Phase 5, Eventual Transition. Long-term residency. Diminished external contact. Medical oversight escalation. Natural decline management. Natural decline. A euphemism so cold it stole the air from the room. There were projected timelines next to each item. Some months. Some weeks. Some vague enough to adjust. But the trigger, the one Elric had stopped, was circled. Highlighted. Annotated. If subject attempts independent travel, initiate phase 4 immediately. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of the realization pressing down on me. They hadn't been reacting to me. They'd been following a plan. Every moment of concern. Every gentle correction. Every medication. Every signature. All of it had been decided long before I packed that bag. Tonight was never about leaving. It was about when. I thought of the dates already passed. The quiet milestones I'd crossed without knowing. The invisible doors that had closed behind me. If I'd walked out that door, I wouldn't have come back. Not as myself. I closed the folder carefully, photographing every page, every annotation, every checkmark. My hands didn't shake this time. Because fear had been replaced by something else. Clarity. The kind that only comes when you see the entire machine at once. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was logistics. And logistics don't hesitate. I slipped the folder back into place and locked the cabinet just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. Elric paused outside the study. I met his eyes when he stepped in. I found it, I said quietly. He didn't ask what. His jaw tightened. Then we're closer than they think, he replied. Tonight hadn't been a warning. It had been a deadline. If this story is making you angry, don't just feel it, subscribe. Because every unsubscribed viewer is one more person who might ignore this happening in real life. And if you still won't subscribe, say why, say it in the comments. I couldn't sleep after finding the plan. I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, listening to the house prepare itself. Not in the way a home usually does, with warmth or comfort, but like a stage being set. Lights adjusted. Doors unlocked. Timers aligned. By the time the doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock, I was ready. Elric opened the door with his usual quiet efficiency. Jareth stepped inside first. He looked calm. Relieved, even. As if the hardest part were already behind him. Dr. Halden Reese followed, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man accustomed to being trusted without question. They didn't rush. That was the tell. People in a hurry are afraid of being stopped. These two expected compliance. Good morning, Lorianne, Jareth said warmly, touching my shoulder. You remember Dr. Reese, don't you? I stared at him for a beat too long. Then smiled, uncertain. I think so, I said. You're the nice one. Dr. Reese's lips curved into a practiced, reassuring smile. That's right, he said. I'm here to help. They sat me in the living room, exactly where the light was best, where the camera above the bookshelf could see my face clearly. Ulrich stood near the doorway, silent. Invisible. Perfect. Dr. Reese opened his notebook. We just want to ask you a few questions, Lorianne. Nothing difficult. I nodded too quickly. Yes. Questions. I like questions. Jareth's hand tightened on my shoulder, pleased. What day is it today? Dr. Reese asked. I frowned, counting on my fingers. It's after Monday. Before Friday. He nodded, jotting something down. And do you know why we're here? I leaned in conspiratorially. Because I get confused, I whispered. That's what he says. I pointed at Jareth. Jareth smiled sympathetically. She worries about being a burden. Dr. Reese didn't look up. That's very common. They were building it in real time. A diagnosis constructed from performance. And I gave them everything they wanted. I repeated questions. I contradicted myself. I forgot names. Then, carefully, precisely, I let them talk. We've discussed care options before, Jareth said, a little too easily. Given the escalation, it may be time for a more structured environment. Dr. Reese nodded. Especially considering the safety concerns. What safety concerns? I asked, my voice small. Jareth sighed, the long-suffering husband. You don't remember the incident with the stairs? Or the time you tried to leave the house at night? Dr. Reese looked up sharply. You've attempted to leave? Yes, Jareth said. Just last night, actually. There it was. Ulrich shifted almost imperceptibly. And that's dangerous, Dr. Reese said. Patients at this stage can be a risk to themselves. I clasped my hands together. So I shouldn't go out alone? No, Jareth said quickly. Not anymore. Dr. Reese closed his notebook. In cases like this, immediate placement is often the most compassionate choice. Immediate? I echoed. Yes, he said. Before another incident occurs. They weren't discussing me. They were discussing logistics. I don't want to be alone, I murmured. You won't be, Jareth assured me. You'll be taken care of. Dr. Reese added, facilities like the one we discussed are designed to ease the transition. Millbrook, Jareth said, without thinking. Dr. Reese froze. Just for a second. Enough. That facility, Dr. Reese corrected smoothly. Yes. I tilted my head. You've already chosen it? Silence. Then Jareth laughed lightly. We looked at options. Dr. Reese cleared his throat. Preliminary discussions. Nothing final. But there's paperwork, I said softly. Isn't there? They exchanged a glance. The kind of glance people exchange when they forget who's supposed to be confused. We like to be prepared, Jareth said. Prepared. That word again. Dr. Reese leaned forward. Lorianne, do you feel safe here? I hesitated. Long enough. Then shook my head. No, I whispered. I don't think so. Jareth's breath caught. Because I don't understand what's happening, I continued. And people keep deciding things without telling me. Dr. Reese straightened. Who decides, he asked. Jareth answered too fast. I do. For her. There it was. Authority asserted. Documented. Elric's phone lay face down on the table behind them. Recording everything. I looked at Dr. Reese. You said this was for my good. But you never asked me what I wanted. Dr. Reese opened his mouth. Closed it. That's not necessary at this stage, he said finally. I nodded, slowly. Then I suppose you won't mind explaining it to someone else. The room went still. Jareth frowned. Explaining what? I leaned back in my chair. This conversation, I said. In its entirety. Elric stepped forward. And for the first time since this began, they noticed him. Really noticed him. His phone was in his hand. Recording light blinking. Dr. Reese went pale. Jareth stood abruptly. Turn that off. Elric didn't move. You expected confusion, I said calmly. So I gave it to you. I met Jareth's eyes. But you forgot something. What? He snapped. Confused people don't document conspiracies, I said. And they don't sit quietly while you incriminate yourselves. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was realization. They weren't in control anymore. No one raised their voice after Elric revealed the recording. That's the part people never expect. There was no shouting. No threats. No dramatic exit. Just a quiet, collective understanding that something irreversible had begun. Jareth sat back down slowly, as if standing might make things worse. Dr. Halden Reese adjusted his glasses, hands no longer steady, eyes flicking, not to me, but to the walls. To the house. As if it had turned on him. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Dr. Reese said carefully. This conversation may have crossed professional boundaries. Elric didn't respond. Neither did I. Silence is powerful when the truth is already speaking. Jareth tried next. Elric, let's be reasonable. You're employed here. This kind of behavior. You're mistaken, Elric said quietly. I was employed here. That landed harder than any accusation. He walked past them, unlocked the study, and removed the locked filing cabinet drawer I had photographed weeks earlier. He placed it on the table. Click. The sound echoed. Inside were copies. Property transfers. Care continuity plans. Insurance riders. Facility correspondence. Medication adjustment logs with initials that didn't match prescriptions. Jareth's face drained of color. Dr. Reese reached for the folder, then stopped himself, as if touching it might leave fingerprints. This will need to be reviewed by appropriate parties, Dr. Reese said. Privately. No, Elric replied. It won't. That afternoon passed without drama. That's the truth people struggle to accept. Justice doesn't usually arrive with flashing lights. It arrives with emails, scheduled calls, and people who suddenly stop answering their phones. Elric made one call. Then another. He didn't tell me who. He didn't need to. By evening, Dr. Reese left without his briefcase. He forgot it. Or maybe he knew better than to take it. Jareth didn't leave. He paced. Checked his phone. Made calls that went unanswered. By morning, the power dynamic had shifted so completely it was almost invisible. A woman from Adult Protective Services arrived. She didn't introduce herself loudly. She didn't look at me like I was fragile. She sat beside me, not across, and asked one question. Do you understand why we're here? Yes, I said. Because people thought I wouldn't. She smiled, not kindly, but respectfully, and nodded. The investigation unfolded in layers. Dr. Reese wasn't arrested. Not yet. But his practice was suspended pending review. His diagnoses flagged. His patient list audited. Patterns began to emerge. Same language. Same escalation timelines. Same facilities. Different houses. Different families. Jareth lost access first. Then authority. Then credibility. The power he'd wielded quietly, through paperwork and tone, collapsed under scrutiny. Accounts were frozen. Transfers reversed. Documents challenged. He wasn't charged that week. But he was exposed. And for someone like him, exposure was worse. I learned later, through fragments, that I wasn't the first. There were others. People whose confusion had been convenient. Whose voices had been softened by medication adjustments. Whose homes had quietly changed hands. Some of them never questioned it. Some of them couldn't. And some, like me, had almost left the house on the wrong night. Ulrich stayed until everything was documented. Then he left without ceremony. No goodbye. No thanks. Just a note on the kitchen table. You listened when it mattered. The house felt different after that. Not safer. Honest. And honesty is louder than fear once you recognize it. The sun rose over the quiet street, spilling light into the living room where I had spent weeks half hidden, half watching, half surviving. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like it had survived something too, and so had I. Ulrich appeared in the doorway once more. No words. No apologies. Just the same quiet presence that had warned me, that had stayed when I didn't even know I needed him. He placed a small envelope on the counter. Everything you need is inside, he said, voice low, almost reverent. The rest is yours. And then he was gone. Just like that. The mission complete. Not a hero's exit. Not a dramatic farewell. Just a door closing behind someone who had saved more than a life. He preserved my autonomy. Spence Calder arrived that afternoon, sleeves rolled up, notebook in hand. There was work to be done. Together, we set up a small advocacy trust for elders who might face the same insidious threats I had endured. It was anonymous, discreet, structured to respond quietly but effectively. A lifeline for those whose voices were often silenced before anyone noticed. He helped me understand the power of documenting, of reporting safely, of creating systems that others could use even when they felt alone. It wasn't about heroics. It wasn't about revenge. It was about turning experience into protection. There was no romance. Never a trace of it. Spence's loyalty wasn't the soft kind that courts hearts, it was the hard kind that defends life and dignity. And in my life now, that was exactly what mattered. Respect, autonomy, and control over my own existence. I wandered through the house, slowly reclaiming each corner. The locks I'd feared were traps became symbols of my survival. The furniture rearranged itself in ways I chose, not ways intended to confuse or dominate me. Each object, each wall, each room whispered the same truth: I belonged here. And I had always deserved to. Letters arrived occasionally. Notes from other elders, quiet thanks from families who had used the trust we'd established. Sometimes the words were trembling, sometimes determined. But they were always clear: someone had listened, and someone had acted. I kept a corner of the house for that work. The rest was mine. A home, finally, not as a character in someone else's story, but as Lorianne, fully present, fully capable, and fully alive. Even as the days stretched into weeks, even as the shadow of the past lingered faintly in memory, I understood one enduring truth. Survival isn't only about escaping danger, it's about claiming your own life after danger has passed. And this house, this small reclaimed space, was proof that I had done exactly that. No one could define me again. Not my family, not Jareth, not Dr. Reese. And certainly not the world that thought someone like me could be quietly erased. Here, I belonged. Here, I chose. Here, I lived. Peace is quieter than danger. That was the first thing I noticed once everything was over. No footsteps pacing at night. No whispered calls behind closed doors. No papers quietly disappearing from my desk. And yet, the fear didn't leave with them. It stayed in smaller ways. I kept the lights on longer than I used to. I double-checked locks that had never been for my protection. I paused before answering the door, even when I was expecting someone. Because once you understand how quietly control can move through a life, you never fully forget it. The advocacy trust began to grow. Slowly. Carefully. Messages arrived without names attached. Just fragments. They said it was temporary. My doctor changed without my consent. I signed something I didn't understand. My mother stopped calling. Different cities. Different families. Same pattern. That was when the final truth settled in. My case wasn't rare. It was incomplete. The system that almost erased me hadn't been dismantled. Only interrupted. There were still professionals who spoke gently while documenting someone's disappearance from their own life. Still families who learned the right words to say: confusion, burden, safety, to make decisions irreversible. Still houses where someone packed a bag believing they were doing the responsible thing. I kept thinking about that night. About how close I came to leaving. About how easily it could have ended differently. If Elric hadn't been there. If I hadn't listened. If I had trusted the version of myself they were trying to convince me I was. I never heard from Elric again. Not a letter. Not a call. Not a message. Just the echo of his warning. Sometimes I stand in the hallway where he grabbed my wrist. And I replay the moment in my mind, not with fear, but with clarity. Elric saved me that night. But I still wonder. How many others left their houses? Believing it was for their own good. Believing they were confused. Believing someone else knew better. And never came back. The house is quiet now. But the question isn't,